projects that sell, beginner builds to get you started, skill builders, weekend projects, one board builds. These days there is a wealth of knowledge and an array of builds to choose from on YouTube. So, what do you choose to make? I'll explain as we go. And to help with that, in this video we're going to do 3 builds. The first one is going to be easy and just with beginner tools. The second one, slightly more testing. And then, well, the third will use slightly more intermediate tools. And if you're building along, I've made this video slightly more detailed just to help. And I really do hope it helps. Okay, project 1, easy. And a first dip into my take on what projects you guys should be choosing. And this is all about attainable wood choices. Don't choose a project that needs wood that you either don't have, can't get your hands on, can't afford, or can't work. Rather, choose wood that you do have and that you can work with, and choose a project that suits that. This build, for instance, it's great. You can use whatever wood you like. And so for this, I'm going to use some rustic wood with a nice patina. You could also call it some battered reclaimed pine from an old workbench that I stripped down a long time ago. Now dimensions, they're not really important for this build particularly, but for reference, I'm starting with 2 different types of boards. Thicker one is around 35mm thick and around 220mm wide. I'm starting with a length of 500mm, but we'll cut that down. I've also got 2 thinner boards that are 20mm in thickness and a very similar width to the larger board. And tool-wise, all you really need is a circular saw and its best friend, the speed square. Or, even better than that, a large speed square. I'll show you why shortly. So let's get started, and the first thing we're going to do is take our circular saw, and using this adjustment at the front, we're going to change the angle. And for this I'm setting myself to 12.5. But as this angle dictates the splay of the legs on the stool we're going to make, what I suggest is watch the build, take a look at the finished product, and then choose your angle accordingly. And also while I was at it, I did a series of test cuts to determine not only the angle, but also the depth of the cut that I was going to do. Looking at about 15mm here. I don't need all of this bigger board, so using my speed square, I'm going to make 2 opposing angled cuts. I'm trying to pick the best looking piece, as this will be the top of the stool we're building. And I do recommend one of these larger speed squares, especially with a wider board like this. I'll pop a link in the description for it. You may find that your saw at an angle may not get all the way through the thicker wood. That's fine. In fact, for this design, I've only aimed for half the depth, as I'm now going to flip the board, and then with a straight blade set to the remaining depth, I'm going to finish the through cut and get our board to the right length while also giving it a really nice underbevel. And for now, that's all we're going to be doing to this part. It's only a very subtle feature due to the shallow nature of the angle. And in truth, if you do that and find it's a little bit disappointing and you want to have a real feature of it, make a different angle. But now, we need to make some legs. And so with the circular saw set back to the same angle as before, so for me 12.5, we're going to cut the thinner boards now. I don't mind admitting that I've ruined a fair bit of wood in the past by cutting legs too short, so if you're in any doubt as to the height you'd like your stool, don't worry. Cut the legs long, you can always adjust them a bit later on. And the cuts are made in much the same way using the speed square. The only difference being, instead of opposing angles this time, we're going for parallel. Oh yeah, and honestly, once these legs are cut, you're nearly there. Right now I've got 2 identical legs, each one with parallel angles top and bottom. I plan to sink the legs into the top of this stool to add a little bit more strength and a nice feature. And to do that, we're going to take the skill we've already learnt already, and we're going to make some angle cuts partially through the underside of the stool's top. And there's going to be bonus points if you can get the depth of these to match the depth of the angle cut we did originally, just for aesthetics. But it's not a deal breaker. So, just like before, I'm using the circular saw and speed square to make all of the cuts. I like to start at one end, and then using the leg that's actually going to sit in it, I like to slowly sneak up on a fit, gradually moving the speed square across 1 kerf width at a time, or clamping a guide on, and test regularly, especially at the end. A little tight, and you can nudge the square or guide across, but a little loose and, well, it's still fine, but as with any skill, let's aim for as good as we can get and forgive any slight errors. And remember, the 2 grooves now need to be at opposite angle, and the angle needs to match the angle we cut on the legs. And a quick reminder as to why you need opposing angles here, because if you don't do opposing angles, well, what you're making there is a giant bookstand, or possibly the worst stool you've ever offered to a guest in your house. But with opposing angles, you can get everything cleaned up and you can try yourself a little test fit. This is where you'll really decide if the height's right. But if you're happy with what you've got overall, now's the time to make the brace piece for this bit in here. And let's be honest, if you try and fill this gap absolutely perfectly, that's going to get quite tricky, especially if you absolutely want it to sit against the bottom of the stool itself. So we're just not going to care. There's two ways of making your life a little bit easier here. Either take a bevel gauge and reference the angle between the table leg and the bottom of the top of the stool. Then cut a slice from your board using your circular saw. Then once you've made the first cut, offer it up to the stool, mark it and then cut the other side. But do all of this aiming for around 3/4 of the way up the leg. Don't aim to get it perfectly against the top. Once you've cut the second side, you come in from the bottom and you snug it up to where you get a nice flush fit on both angles. Method 2. So for option 2, we're going to cut it just like before, and then we're going to take our length right off the top and make it just a little bit shorter. And then all you have to do is offer it up and with a hand plane shave off the top every time it doesn't fit. Each time you shave off the top length gets a little bit longer until finally you can get it snugged up against the bottom of the stool top. Now with the brace piece in nice and snug, I've decided to make one more design change on the fly. I really like the underbeveling on the top of this stool, and I also like the joinery on the legs, but I'd like to set it back a little way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my hand plane and I'm just doing another underbevel on both of the long sides of the stool, just up to the stage where the bevel overlaps the top of the groove holding the legs in place. And as with any of the design choices we're making, none of this is vital. These are all little touches that will add to the aesthetics of the finished piece. And now all of our individual pieces are done. Now I've got to be honest, it doesn't look like much, but this is all of the pieces you need for your stool. However, they're still a little bit rough. So I'm not going to make the mistake I always make in these projects. I'm not going to glue it up until I've sanded it a little bit first, but I'm not going to show you any of that. How much time you decide to sand this, that's totally up to you. You can leave it rustic, you could give it this battered look and just take off all the corners and leave it at that, or you could take it up to a super high grit and give it a nice crisp finish. Me, I'm probably going to go somewhere in between, but you'll see at the next stage. So with everything cleaned up, sanded up, and now fitted, ready to go, I've had to make a bit of a decision on the fly, if you like. This is a rustic stool, and as such, you've got a lot of leeway with it. I was hoping that all the joints would be nice and tight, so all I'd have to do is glue it, and then just pin it through the sides with a couple of dowels. Now, I probably could do that. I could probably get away with it, but instead, I'm going to glue these joints here and here. I'm going to countersink some screws through the bottom of the brace piece into the actual seat. Then I'm going to countersink some screws in through the legs into the brace. And so, here it is, the finished stool. A project you can sell or gift, a skill builder, a weekend project, or even a one board build, if you've got one board that's slightly thinner than the other, potentially. You may also notice, whether it's conscious or subconscious, that having the same angles throughout actually is more pleasing to the eye. But whether you slightly overcut the grooves for your legs to sit in, or it hasn't got the perfect finish, or you have to confess that actually the painter's triangles you used dug in and left divots in the top, none of that matters. You've made something, you've learnt some new skills, you've practiced, and you've got something you should be proud of. And now, well, we've still got 2 builds left, so let's get on with number 2. This is about choosing to introduce a new skill on a simple project that you can then use to enhance your next build, as you're going to see in the 3rd project. So with that in mind, let's make a clipboard. Now please don't skip, this is not going to be a boring piece of ply with a cheap clip attached to it. Instead, we're going to take a 6mm piece of ply and we're going to veneer it. And cards on the table, although I have done this before, this sign for instance, in this particular build, I'm going to try 2 ways. One, the usual way, and the second one that I'm really hoping is going to be a far more beginner-friendly way of getting into veneering. But before we get to the veneer, we need to sink a couple of magnets into the ply first. And these need to be as flush as possible, but if they aren't, it is better that they are just below the surface rather than just proud. I'm just using these thin magnets here and some 5-minute epoxy. Why? Well, you'll see very soon. And now we can veneer. Method 1 first, the usual way. This is veneer, and in this case, this is Sapele veneer. And the main reason that I use this on many projects is once it's actually mounted to ply, it's far more stable than solid wood itself. It opens up a huge range of choices at a fraction of the cost of solid wood, especially in the case of exotic woods. As a beginner, it's a really easy way of adding fancy features to your projects. We're going to use method 1 on the first side, and I bought some cold pressed veneer glue just for the job. Honestly, I've had good results with normal glue, but this is what's recommended for the job. I am hoping that the second method we try will mean that you won't have to buy this fancy glue. We'll get onto that in a sec. The first job is to ensure that the veneer is actually wide enough to cover your ply. And if, like mine, it isn't, you need to square off the 2 joining edges. The simplest way I've found of doing this is to make your own veneer shooting board. And don't worry, that may sound really complicated, but I promise you it is super simple. You basically clamp a straight edge, just a hair away from the edge of the veneer, and then lightly plane up to the board. And as the veneer is so thin, as long as you've got a half decent edge on whatever hand plane you're using, this will end up being a really satisfying job. And you'll get good results. Just keep going until you feel the iron biting into the plywood. And it goes without saying, don't use a metal straight edge instead of plywood. Use something forgiving on your plane iron. And once you open the veneer back out, the joint should be absolutely perfect. Then use a gentle tape. Veneer paper tape is best, but this low stick painter's tape is just about fine. Apply a little glue and lie flat for about 40 minutes. The veneer. Lie the veneer flat for about 40 minutes. Then apply a thin layer of glue to the plywood substrate. And a great little tip here is just to use pencil lines spread across the surface of the ply before you apply the glue, and then you can just check that you haven't applied the glue too thick. Should be able to still see those pencil lines quite clearly. Then apply the veneer. You can tape edges a little to stop any slide if you find that's happening. Pop some wax paper over the veneer, another board above and beneath it, and then just apply even clamping pressure, ensuring you get pressure right across the centre too. I've just adapted a couple of my cools here to make sure that I'm getting pressure across the centre by applying increasing amounts of blue tape as you get to the centre of the cool to create a slight hump. We then leave it overnight to cure. I've given this 24 hours. Once the clamps come off, you can trim the edges. Just make sure you're going with the grain so you don't get any tear out, and take a bit of extra care around the corners. But don't worry about making the finish perfect just yet. I was just cutting the edges off here and I saw the green tape. The green tape was used on the side that wasn't supposed to be glued to the substrate so that I could then peel it off once everything had cured. But I've glued it to the substrate. It does leave me with a bit of a predicament. Do I scrap all of this and start again? Do I cut all this footage out and never show you and just pretend that it all went well? Maybe fake taking off the tape? Or do we just leave it in there and continue, and it will forever be a reminder that we all make mistakes? And now for the second side. This is slightly different, but hopefully more beginner friendly. And just know, this is also my first time doing this too, and I'm hoping to take this forward onto more projects if it works. The first job is just to scuff the ply surface lightly with 120 grit sandpaper. Then once you've cleaned off all the dust, you can apply a sealant layer of shellac or varnish to the untreated surfaces, like this ply. So, in 24 hours time, I'll let you know how it's worked. So this second side has now had 24 hours for the sanding sealant shellac to cure. And there's a big bonus here. This second piece of veneer that I'm going to use is actually peel and stick, which means that once you peel the paper off the back, underneath you've already got adhesive. And because luckily it's already big enough for the ply, that means we haven't got to join any bits together. You just peel the back off, place it down in the middle, and then roller it out to avoid bubbles. I'm using this, well, I don't know. This is an antique roller that I got in one of my auction lots. So now with both sides veneered, now's a very good time to just report back on a few things. Firstly, it's a little bit more time and effort to do it with real veneer than the peel and stick veneer that we've used on this side. And it feels to me like the sticky back veneer comes with a bit of a better finish. It's already had a bit of a sanding by the look of it. However, it does feel a little bit thinner, so you have to be a bit careful. But so far, I don't hate it. And I think for beginners, doing a little bit of veneering for their first couple of projects, that might end up being a lower cost way of getting into veneering. You haven't got to buy the glue, and it's not messy. You might also be asking why veneer both sides. This is a common mistake that gets made. Even though this is just a thin veneer, it's still wood, and so it still acts like wood, and it will contract and expand the same way wood will. And if you only veneer one side, and this dries out and contracts, your whole board is going to cup. But if you veneer both sides, then they will cup and cancel each other out. You could put strips of veneer around the edge to hide the plywood end grain here, but I want to go a little fancier, and in turn, a little bit more durable. You see, plywood edges tend to chip really easily. So not only is this going to be a bit of a fancy extra, but it's also going to be incredibly practical. I'm flattening off the edges with my shooting board and my hand plane, and then I'm just going to glue some thin, solid sapele strips to the outside. I'm going to mitre the edges, which is really easy if you just take your time and sneak up on a fit. Now, if you've ever seen me edge band any of the cabinets I've made, you will have seen this technique before. As the banding is difficult to clamp, I'm just stretching blue tape over it as a makeshift clamp. It'll hold the banding in place while the glue cures, and it comes away easily enough afterwards. I gave it around a few hours before peeling it off so I could sand everything flush. I won't show you too much of this, but I do take it very carefully sanding veneer, as you can go through it so quick. And now we need a clip. And I originally bought these. This is a cheap clip just off Amazon that you screw onto your clipboard. But honestly, they are cheap and nasty. So instead, I made this. It's just a block made up of two of my favourite types of wood with magnets inset underneath. And the magnets match up with the magnets in the clipboard. So when it's on, it holds everything down. How strong? Good enough. But honestly, you could just get away with a simple batten with the magnets in it. And then the last job is just to apply some finish. For this, I'm just using Osmo oil. It feels like it's gone off quite quickly, but you do have to leave it about a week to fully cure, but that's fine. And with the finish in place, that's the second one done. And I really, really like how this has turned out. I confess, I was a little bit worried about the peel and stick veneer that we had on the back. I didn't know if it would end up looking like a bit of a plasticky finish, especially when you compare it to the interesting grain that you've got on the front. But I'm pleasantly surprised, and when I was shopping for this, they do all sorts of different types of wood. What I really like though, is using magnets for the clip. I think that is a really nice touch, and it's tactile. So whether you need a clipboard or whether you want to learn a new skill, veneering, give it a shot. And now we move on to project number 3. And this is no harder than the last, it just uses a few more tools. And what we're going to build is a box. I'm going to show you how to make it accurate, repeatable and easy. Plus I want us to use a skill that we've just learned, and I want to try out a new technique. So that's why I'm choosing this build. And the beauty is you can add simple custom touches to the lid that set your work apart from anybody else. Let's very quickly talk wood choices here. I've milled down 2 boards of sapele. Both of them are around about 10mm thick. One is 85mm wide and the other one is 55mm wide. When you're choosing the width that you want here, remember the way we're making this width is going to be the combination of the base of the box and the lid of the box plus whatever you're going to cut off in between. And the reason I'm building 2 is because I want to show you 2 different techniques. One of which I've used for years and the other one, well, that's new to me. So I want to test myself out as well. So we have the sides, but we're going to need a lid and a base. So I've taken a skill that we learnt with the clipboard and I've veneered 2 pieces of plywood. I've used the sapele that you've seen before for the inside, but on the top, on the show face of the box, I've got this stunning burl and I've made a lid for both boxes. I haven't trimmed them down to size yet. You're going to see why when we start cutting the box. You see, this is exactly what I was talking about earlier. Practice with a cheaper veneer on something like the clipboard, so that then you can use that skill on something that's a little bit more detailed, a little bit more difficult down the line. First things first, let's get on with the box. Now in most builds, and with boxes in particular, I like to leave the board as long as possible for as long as possible. So before cutting, let's make the grooves to house the lid and the base. On the first box, I'll make grooves with the table saw. That's really simple. Set your blade to half the thickness of the wood, then running the board over it will create a groove the width of the blade's kerf. Then you can nudge the fence over and make another pass to gradually widen the groove, testing the fit each time with what you're going to use as the lid and the base. Now the reason I'm showing you two ways here is because this way means taking the blade guard off your table saw. And when it comes to safety, now that has to be your choice, not mine. And that's why we're going to do a second method. It is pretty similar but cut with a router table. The end result is much the same. Choose what works best and importantly feels safest to you. And as we have two boxes, I'm going to try another technique new to me to see if it makes the process any easier. And this is something I saw Steve Ramsey do a while ago and I've always wanted to try. So let's see together if we can pull it off. So we've got our two existing grooves and then we make another groove. Now this should be around half the thickness of the wood and the bottom of that groove is where you want the lid to end. So that's it for grooves. Now I want these boxes to be held together with mitre joints, which is where two pieces of wood meet and there's a 45-degree angle split down the middle of them on the joint. Rebates would work here perfectly, but I really like the look of mitre joints. And the main reason I like it is because it creates a really nice grain wrap going all the way around the box, especially when you cut everything from the same board. But I mentioned earlier that I want these boxes to be repeatable. I want it to be quick, safe and easy. And the way to do that is with a jig. Now you could use a sled for this purpose, but what I really like in a workshop is a jig for every task that I have. Some of you would want one jig that does it all, but I really like specialist jigs for specialist jobs. And this jig's really simple. You just take a piece of ply or MDF, add a runner that is the exact size of your table saw mitre track, then with that secured, cut one edge to a 45-degree angle. This little box makes setting the blade really easy, and the saw stop actually has a micro adjust for the angle, which also helps to get it dialed in. Remember, when you're taking a zero reference for the box, take it off the actual tabletop rather than the clearance plate. Then with the runner secured using a little bit of CA glue and some screws, we can then add our reference batten, ensuring that we get a good 90-degree angle to the cut line. Now the bottom batten is for the first cut, the second is for our second cut, and you've got to leave enough room in between for the width of whatever wood you're cutting for your box. And as an added bonus, if you make these nice and heavy duty, you can always clamp on stops, because the length from the cut line to wherever the stop is on this top line dictates the width of your box. And you might need two if you're not going to do a square box, one for the short sides, one for the long sides. Me, I'm going to try a square box today because, well, I haven't made one. So here's the method, and it is really simple. First, place the board groove side down against the lower batten. Make your first 45-degree cut. Then rotate the board so that it's still groove side down with a 45-degree cut against the stop block. Make another cut. This is your first side done. Mark it and repeat the process. Cards on the table. If my hands look like they are too close to the blade and the blade hasn't got a guard on, well, that's because they are and it hasn't, and it is not right. I've only noticed this in the edit, and so I've made another jig, I've made an adaptation, but let me show you all the process first, because the process is the same regardless, and then I'll show you how I've updated the jig to make it safer. So when you make the next 45-degree cut, line the cut line against the battens, because these are not only there for reference, but also they're going to provide a zero clearance backer to avoid tear out. And then once you've made that 45-degree cut, you rinse and repeat the process for all of the sides of the box. So here's the simple addition that I've made to this jig. Instead of clamping a little block of wood on at the top, I've actually put a hold down clamp, and I'm using some micro jig dovetail hardware to ensure that it can slide in a groove. So that way, not only do you have a fully versatile stop block that you can move backwards and forwards and lock in place, the stop block itself provides a clamp that holds the bit of wood down when it's at its smallest, when your fingers are closest to the blade, and this gives you that added security. Tie this together with the fact that the crown guard should be on, and it is on now, and that will give you confidence in this process, and the jig will not only make it quick, repeatable and easy, but also make it safe. So with all the sides done on both boxes, now we've got to test the fit. Easiest way of doing this is to lay it flat, pop your tape on, and then bring everything together. It's better than joining the corner then putting tape on, because what the tape does when you bring it together from flat is it stretches and it pulls the outside of that mitre nice and tight. Next job, we have to measure from the inside of each of the grooves to cut the lid and the base to the right size to sit in the box. The advice I'll give you for this is to sneak up on a fit again. Lots of cutting, lots of checking, and you don't need it to be so tight because we're going to glue it anyway, because we veneered the wood. We don't have to worry about wood movement. Before any glue's applied, it's best to do a little bit of sanding here. And I'm going to confess, for the outside of the box, I probably should have sanded when everything was in one long strip still. For the first box, you won't actually need to sand the interior yet because we're going to add another piece of wood in there to hold the lid on. But for the second box, this interior is as you're going to see it and feel it when you use the box. So now is a really good time to just give it a little sanding. And once you've trimmed the lid down to size, give that a really careful sanding on the veneer just to make sure that you've got a nice finish, because once the lid's in place, it sits down below the sides of the box. It's a little bit trickier to get sandpaper in there. A couple of other things to note when it comes to the glue up. Once these boxes are entirely glued up with the lid and the base in there, you've got no access to clean up any of the squeeze out from the joints. So with that in mind, I take the time to tape off the interior ones that you won't be able to see. Another thing that really helps is watering down a little bit of wood glue and just feeding it into the end grain of the mitres, because then when you actually come to glue everything together, the end grain isn't going to suck all of the glue out of the joint, leave you with a dry joint that might be potentially weak. And one last thing that I've done, because this burl came out so nice after sanding, I decided to put some spray lacquer on it. Now I can tell you this, now I'm going to put a finish on the box that is a very satin, an oil-based finish, but I want the top to pop, because that's the feature. The rest of the box is going to be quite dull, but that feature, that veneer, is what makes it pop. So hopefully a bit of lacquer on that will draw some attention to it. Now we can glue everything up. Remember, we've got the tape on the outer side of the mitres to hold them tight, and then once everything's together, you can decide if you need a couple of extra clamps on there. Be warned with mitre joints though, if you do clamp too hard, you could push the two sides in that will pop out the other two sides due to the nature of the angle. So it's your choice. A ratchet clamp would probably be the best bet if you've got one that is this small. Then once the glue's cured, we've got to remove the lid. So these have been in clamps now for a couple of hours. So now we're going to try and remove the lids, and we've got two ways. One way is the way I always use, which is really simple. I've just attached some blocks to the bottom of a Japanese pull saw using some double-sided tape, and then as long as you're focusing on making the corners meet, everything else can be cleaned up with a hand plane. In fact, everything can be cleaned up with a hand plane, even if you mess this up. Now this isn't the only way of removing a box lid. You could easily run it over your table saw, again ensuring you don't go all the way through. The only thing I don't like about that is that you lose a lot of wood because of the kerf of the blade, so your grain match doesn't meet up as nicely as if you use a Japanese pull saw. And so with the first box lid successfully removed and cleaned up, it's time for the Steve Ramsey method. And for this we need the router table again. Steve says to use an offcut to set up the router. And what we're trying to do here is line up a groove so that it meets the second groove down on the inside, but we're going to cut it on the outside. And we're going to aim for a hair off going all the way through. And like we did with the handsaw, we don't want the lid to come away while we're actually routing. What we want to do is cut the last bit with a knife or a saw and then clean up the edges afterwards. I'm using a push block that I made in a previous video behind the box here to ensure that I don't get too close to the router bit. And as I cut the groove on each side, I can then flip the box over to do the next. If you go all the way through one of these sides now, you can't easily flip to the next side while the box stays stable. So if the first one goes through, lower the bit a little before doing the second. And remember to cut on the lid side until you cut all the way through. Then technically the lid should just slide down onto the box. That was so close. This, it may be 0.5 millimeter out all the way around the depth of the router. If you got it dialed in, this is a really interesting way of making a box. It does involve quite a bit of cleanup on the inside. But first we need to go back to box one. In order to keep the lid on, I'm going to use the same jig I used before on a thinner piece of wood, and I'm going to cut some internal pieces that fit snugly against the inner walls of the box with mitered corners, and they're going to protrude about 5 millimeters off the top, and that will hold the lid into place. And then we can call that one done. And before I show you both boxes, all that needs to be done is some sanding on the outside and then applying some finish. Once I've sanded it to 240 grit, I'm going to apply some nice hard wax oil here. And I think that's going to contrast the shine of the lid really nicely. And then, well, I'm going to show you my finished results. Then you can decide whether it's worth trying a new box making method. And so, with a little bit of finish, these are done. I think if you're starting out right now and you just want to try a few new skills but you don't want to push yourself too far, I think my method that I've used there felt a little bit easier. I could see why it would be fun to use Steve Ramsey's method here. I've ended up chamfering the top and the bottom just a little bit to take away from the fact that the lid isn't perfectly on there. I know this was a really long video. I wanted to get a load of detail in there and I didn't want to cut it down to one build or two. So what I will say is if you are still watching this video, thank you very much. I hope these builds have been useful, maybe even inspiring. As with every video that we do now, there's an after show over on Patreon. You'll find a link down in the description or you can see it through the YouTube memberships. If you head over to either of those, I'll see you over there. Thanks for watching.